Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well, and thank you for tuning into Moose Motion. Be sure to like, comment, share with your friends, and subscribe if you're new if you enjoy the video. This is the Wendigo Supercut, or also known as the Skinwalker, SCP-323. Well, let's just be honest, the guy seems to have a few names out there, and, well, the general sense is he's creepy. Let's be honest. But that is also why he is probably one of my favorite SCPs. Plus, he's Canadian like me, eh? And, well, to be kind of honest, I'm not aware of too many really cool Canadian folklore monsters that we have, although this one is technically kind of based off a real-life person as well. There's a couple different stories about the rendition of it. Anyway, enough with the bitter banter about the Wendigo itself. I'm here to show you how to make your own sculpture out of clay. Of my rendition of the Wendigo, I imagine you could probably switch things around to kind of make it your own character and have a little bit of fun with it, which I definitely highly encourage to be creative. As you can so clearly see at this point, you're probably like, well, this is, he said sculpting. I don't understand why he's drawing. I decided to pick up a pencil for this first bit, which is something I haven't done for a long time, and, well, I'm a little disappointed I didn't start the filming process sooner, because, yeah, it turned out a little better than I was expecting it to. It was just going to do kind of a quick character sketch to get the idea down, but yeah, it turned out pretty decent, if I don't say so myself. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And to be honest, it was kind of nice to start a character design completely from scratch. This way we can take it from paper, a 2D version, and turn it into a 3D version, which I'll admit the character design for the drawing was rather ambitious, so it did take quite a long time to sculpt, unfortunately, so this one will not be a very easy task. However, he does look pretty cool and, well, creepy at the same time, so let's admire the drawing for a little bit here. Obviously get some good beauty shots in of this masterpiece, why not? It took hours, like most of my work, and then we'll dive into the 3D rendering. Now on to the next step, my personal favorite, making him a 3D character, cause, well, clay's been, well, part of my life for a very long time. For those of you who are new here, I've been sculpting for probably about 25 plus years at this point, give or take. At any rate, we're going to start the skeleton process here, which is basically just some armature sculpting wire and some sculpty oven-baked clay. So the trick here is you basically want to add the sculpty clay to the points where you don't want your doll to move. So essentially this is like basically building your stop motion doll frame, so that way you can control the movements, where it happens and what happens, because, well, you kind of want knee joints, elbow joints, and other various things like that, because it helps in the animation process with your movements vastly, because if, well, you move things in the wrong direction, it's gonna look like a broken limb, and, well, that's something that nobody necessarily wants, unless that is the look you're going for. In that case, maybe don't add the very strong skeletal structure. In some cases, people just sculpt things and don't have any skeleton whatsoever. Over the years, I've experimented with a lot of different, sculpting techniques. I remember at a young age, toothpicks was one of my favorites for a combination for armature wire, but the big reason I like to use armature wire at this point is because it helps hold your stuff together big time. Not only that, too, if you have a clay doll that doesn't have a skeleton structure and say you're making his hand wave, the wire helps hold his hand up, because, well, gravity is not your friend a lot of the time when you're dealing with stop motion. A lot of time you're going to be fighting against it. And the wire is just one thing that you can have in your arsenal that's fairly cheap to make sure those movements are staying controlled, and will help you prevent the jankiness that every stop motion or any animator period generally wants to avoid. Not to mention in stop motion's case in particular, having to try and reposition your doll, because God, that is never ever fun, having to try and get back to where you once were. You're almost never going to exactly do that. I'll admit I use a shadow effect on my camera, which helps vastly. However, only so much is capable with that. Anyway, time is flying by here with the project. We now already have the base frame done, so what we're going to do now at this point is add on a second layer of clay because, well, this skeleton is a little bit different than most of the ones that I do. Just because, well, his rib cage is going to be sticking through the entire time, so we're going to have to put a lot of extra detail into that rib cage because, well, it's going to be always showing. In most cases, your skeleton isn't going to be showing, so you can generally just kind of make the basic frame, but not in this case. We're going to make it a little bit more challenging for ourselves. For those of you who know personally, yeah, that's probably not that surprising. I generally don't like making things easy for myself. Screw future me. That guy's a dinks. Yeah. Whatever to make his life more inconvenient, I'll do it. Oh god. Anyway, apart from my banter, let's throw this skeleton back in the oven here for a bit at 275 degrees Fahrenheit or 135 degrees Celsius for those of you on the standard system. That is one thing I must tilt my hat off to for the SculptiClay brand in particular. Generally, I wouldn't recommend rebaking your oven clay, but I've done this several times with this stuff, and I've really pushed the limits. They generally recommend you have a 1/4 inch, and I've done it as thin as 1/8 or even a 1/16. I mean, vary your timing when you're doing thinner stuff. Don't keep it in there for the full 15 minutes that they recommend. Obviously, you're going to have to fluctuate with that a little bit, but I recommend this stuff highly to any sculptors out there. This stuff is pretty incredible and a lot better than that stuff I was given in the art class to throw in the kiln. Like, God, I don't know what it was, but gross. I'm not touching that stuff again in my life. Now we're on to the finer details. That really refined rib cage that's always going to be sticking through. For stuff like this, I'll admit the SculptiClay is a little bit more difficult to work with. It doesn't like to retain its shape very well once it starts getting a little bit warm from your hands, so if you have some rubber sculpting tools or any sort of sculpting tools, this is where I would definitely recommend you get in there with those curves. Now that we're done pulling him in and out of the oven on repeat, his skeleton is now all finally dry and set and ready for, well, the next phase, which is basically just a bunch of sanding and picking and making sure everything's nice and clean, so, which, I mean, to a certain extent doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you are covering it up, but yeah, well, not on the rib cage, so it was a necessary evil in this case. Just keep sanding, sanding. Don't fret. This step is almost over and we'll be on to the next step. Just gonna clean up the spine a little bit here so we have some more definition between our gaps, so that way in the future when we're adding the little spikes that go on the spine, it'll be a little bit easier to track where goes where and what exactly. And now we're going on to the next step, which is, well, more SculptiClay. So what we're going to do here is layer up the ribcage just a little bit more, because, well, personally I don't really like how it doesn't quite stick out enough. It's really small, and unfortunately this stuff kind of does take a little bit of time to build up, so we're going to be adding an extra layer to those rib cages, maybe giving a few extra bones that are missing, adding the spine pieces, and then we'll throw it back in the oven. And yep, don't worry, it still doesn't crack. So this part is going to be difficult, no matter who you are or no matter what your skill set is, I honestly think. This is a spot where you basically have maybe a few millimeters in between each spine, as you can see, so you're really going to have to rely heavily on your tools and your knives just to make sure you get all the gaps nice and even, otherwise it's going to look a little bit funny. Now, onto one of my personal favorite steps of this project in particular, making the skull, which again was no easy task. Being a Wendigo, we're basically going to have the skull showing the entire time, so there's essentially no plaster scene to cover up his face. That's not going to be sculpted out. We're going to have to make his face from Sculpty, so this part did take quite a lot of time and a lot of layering in particular to make sure I got all the fine details that I wanted, but yet again, no cracking or anything like that. Plus, we are also making a working jaw so I can make the guy talk, howl, and various other things, and later on in the video, you'll see how I make that work. It's basically just using a little piece of armature wire as a pin with oven baked clay on either side. It's rather simple, to be honest. I'm a big fan of less is more. Always less is more. Otherwise, making things too complicated is just a headache, personally. So earlier on in the video I mentioned the drawing was a fairly ambitious character design, and by that I kind of meant this part, all those frills and various other things placed right in front of the jaw joint was a bit of a headache, and kind of was like, well, I kind of wish I made something a little bit more simple, but it looks cool, so I stuck with it and did a lot of tweaking around with some, sandpaper, as well as the rubber sculpting tool. So if you're trying to do this on your own, yeah, this part's going to take some patience. And now that some of the finer details are taken care of, we're going to toss it back in the oven for about 5-7 minutes or so, just to make sure we don't lose any of the hard work that we've previously done, because we're going to be adding a little bit more, and, well, we don't want to smush things. And as well as me being a bit of a perfectionist, unfortunately, still wasn't very satisfied with how much those ribs are really popping out, so we're going to add one more layer on those as well, seeing how there's going to be a few other bones that we're adding, like shoulder bones and various other things like that, that are also going to have to be baked as well. So let's just take care of it and, give my mind a little bit of ease, because I know once this step is over and I start adding plasticine, there's really no going back. That being said, that is not entirely true. You can always fix things after the fact. It's just, it is much harder to do. And at that point, you're borderline being a surgeon on a 1/32nd scale, which is, well, can be fun sometimes, but however, it is very time consuming and can be very frustrating. So it's just something that try to avoid at all cost, even though it's bound to happen sooner or later. Now that the skeleton's got its finishing details done, we're going to go back to the skull, the hard part. Well, we're going to be doing a lot of shaving and sanding here once again, because, well, you gotta make sure there's enough clearance for that jaw to work, and I'll admit that was quite a strenuous task, especially being pretty much, I'd say, 99% sculpty clay. The only part not being clay is that little pin in between, as you can see, so that way his jaw can actually move, because there's no other way to do that. I'm sure there might be a few other techniques out there that are perhaps easier to kind of do this sort of stuff with, but I personally really like making my own stuff from scratch because, well, it's more satisfying because, well, it was completely nothing at the beginning and now I turn nothing into something. Which is kind of the whole point about being an artist if you really think about it because, well, it's kind of cool to turn, something that basically means nothing to nobody, be it a blank piece of paper or a random blob of clay, you can now turn that into something that everybody can admire and look up to, which I think is really amazing if you think about it. Because you have to look at that blank canvas or that blob and basically see something that, it clearly is not at the beginning, and then, well, put your mind and hands to work, basically. Now that the lower jaw is all lined up, we are going to move on to some of the finer details at this point, basically doing some of the eye sockets, teeth, and various other things. One tip I have for you, the reason I like to do multiple baking layers is basically so you don't have to fight the clay to kind of keep the previous details that you've already worked so hard to get. It is taking a bit of a risk by doing it, well, multiple baking layers essentially. I don't know how else to put it, because you do run the risk of cracking things at that point, overheating it, so just vary how much time you really put things in between layers. Well, I get to be a Wendigo's dentist today. That feels weird, but hey, it looks cool. So the trick is essentially to place a little bit of that oven baked clay, like a tiny, tiny layer. I'm talking maybe a 1/16 of an inch, or 2 millimeters, or even 1 millimeter. Approximately. I don't really measure a lot of the time when I'm doing this stuff, I'll admit. And then just very, very gently press a clay knife in between those layers to kind of give it some definition so it looks like you have multiple teeth at that point. And as you can see, it's not exactly very big. Now that we got all that done though, we're going to go throw it back in the oven for a little bit and move on to some antler mounts. Now later on, we'll definitely be adding on the antlers. My best piece of advice, because technically those are going to be very, very small. As you can tell, the jaw is no bigger than my pinky, so you can imagine the antlers aren't going to be very big and very thin and fine, so those will be very delicate. So generally with things like that, I like to save it towards the very end, just so I don't run the risk of breaking my fine objects and losing hours of work. It happens sometimes, but I do my best to avoid that. Me trusty sculpting knife. Interesting fact about this little sculpting tool, I've probably had it for 20 years or more, to be honest. It was one of my first sculpting tools, and it's still my favorite. So the idea for these later on is to basically fill this hole up with glue, therefore giving the antlers a little mount. And, well, to be honest, later on what I also do during the sculpting process of the antlers is while they're still soft, shove them in the hole. That way they have a little mounting point, so therefore the glue fits nicely. And you can see the jaw is now working rather nicely. That took a long time, but I'm quite honestly proud of how it turned out. So for any of you who are trying to make it, good luck. It's not an easy task, but it's definitely worth a while. Now, this part's not exactly very easy. I had a lot of issues with this nose part. I'll be honest, I broke it quite a few times and had to re-sculpt it. That luckily isn't on here. You guys won't have to bear that pain. That's only on my end, but just be fair warned, if there's anyone out there trying to make their own little Wendigo skull with this stuff, that part's rather delicate, as well as the teeth. Jeez, those are really fine. Also had to repair those a few times, so be very, very gentle. This stuff takes a lot of work to make and not a lot of work to break. A proud moment for the lower jaw now that it can become one with the rest of the skull. Just be very careful to make sure that pin is the correct length, so it's not sticking out too far on one end and it's nice and smooth. Now we're going to do a quick time attack here with the rib cage. Essentially what I want to do now at this point is paint in between the ribs and give it a nice red coat to give it some added gore for later on when we add some chunks of skin and just have it exposed. That way it looks like, he's got some organs underneath there without having to put too much effort into detail at that point, because it's not going to be all that noticeable, just as long as it looks, well, red and gory. Now that we've put an extraordinary amount of effort into the Wendigo skeleton, we're going to cover about 80 to 90% of it all up with plasticine. The exciting part. Ooh. Now, what I recommend for this part is basically starting off with all the joints. So all the spaces in between your bones, essentially, get those covered up right away because that's going to be the most delicate part. Therefore, the plasticine acts as a little bit of a, barrier or buffer to kind of help keep everything together, as well as give you that first layer of plasticine that you so desperately need. So later on, essentially, the idea will be taking different chunks of plasticine that are shaped like various different muscle groups and then add them on for tone and texture. But first of all, we're going to take care of the first layer. So essentially what you really want to do is focus on making sure you have no air pockets or anything like that in the clay. So it's going to require a lot of hand massaging and just kind of working the clay, making sure that it's all tight and sealed where you actually want it and there's no air in between anything. P.S. Having your really fine-tuned skull not glued to your sculpture while working on it is not a good idea. Don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do. And then we're going to work on the arm chunks, essentially just kind of sealing those off. Because, those are really long and gangly and probably going to be rather delicate. So make sure you seal these well. Now, this is a part that is, kind of awkward. Trying to work in between all those tiny little spaces with the spine is not easy. You're definitely going to want a tool of some sort because there's no way your fingers are going to get in between there. For me, personally, that means taking out your trusty rubber sculpting tools. These things are pretty awesome for fine details and cleaning up tool marks. For those of you who do not have access to those, I would recommend a toothpick or a small little stick or shaft or even a piece of armature wire. Should probably get the job done as well. So now at this point we are ready to put on the different muscle layers, so it's going to be basically like a giant, muscle puzzle. Essentially, different prefabricated or sculpted chunks are going to be placed in various different places to make, obviously, muscle layers and some nice buns. Oh yes. So the idea for this layer is essentially kind of like the first one. Obviously, you want to make sure we do things in thin sheets and make sure there's no air. But at the same time, you have to be careful how much you work the clay and where you work it, because this is your kind of one of your final layers, and essentially this is what people are going to see. So what you want to do is make sure that you have the nice tone and definition of what your muscles are actually supposed to look like, whilst making sure there is no air or any other little imperfections in there. So this is kind of a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun and it's the most rewarding part. Well, not exactly the most rewarding. I'd say finishing it is probably the most rewarding part. However, this is the point where you actually kind of see all things kind of come together and it actually starts to look like a person, or in this case, a creepy monster. A little concerned about the paintbrush being almost too thick and making things kind of look. Now this is an important step. You're really going to want to pay close attention to the layer between the ribcage and the stomach, because later on that's going to be a bit of a problem area, especially if he's going to be bending over and standing up, because essentially that layer plasticine is going to want to separate from the ribcage. So you're going to want to get something in there and make sure you have no air and it's nice and sealed up between the ribs and the stomach. So at this point, there isn't really a whole lot for me to commentary for the next little bit. Essentially, you're just going to want to do a lot of finger blending is the best thing to do. And for those tight spaces, be sure to grab a tool like a toothpick or something round and pointy. I personally tend to use a lot of my rubber sculpting tools to get into those tight spaces, but yep, that's pretty much all we're going to be doing for the next little bit. Oh, hello there. I am back for a short bit. Just want to comment on this motion I'm particularly doing with my hand there. You can really see what I'm essentially trying to do is make sure there's no air in between those joints. Over a period of time, I've learned to kind of feel out how to find those air pockets. It's a little tough to describe, but essentially it's a little soft spot and you can kind of mush it in a little bit easier than the rest of the clay without having to push too hard. It's kind of a fine line between, learning how much pressure to really apply to keep things in shape without warping it too much and finding the weak spots. It's weird, but over time you really learn and see with your hands, especially when you're a sculptor. And I'll admit, having some mechanical background does also help. I also have to reach into blind spots where I can't see things with my hands and figure it out from there. Nom 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 nom. So the next little bit here, you're going to see a recurring pattern. A lot of the rubber sculpting tools are going to be put to good use here. So I did some clever brainstorming to kind of come up with a solution for if you perhaps do not have one of these. You could probably try a pencil with sharpened eraser. I mean, it's not exactly the same rubber quality. This stuff that they use seems to be fairly soft in comparison to what a pencil would be, but if someone was in a pinch and really wanted to give that a shot before buying one, you could try it. I will even try it myself at some point, just to see if it works. Now for the delicate issue that we were saving for the end, the antlers. One of the last details, mainly because I'm scared I don't want to break things, so what we're going to basically start off with is a good piece of armature wire to get that foundation of the antler itself, and then add on a little bits of strips of sculpty clay to give it the appearance of kind of like a elk antler is kind of what I was going for personally. You could always switch it around. The Wendigo has been known to have several different types of antlers. I personally just like the way the elk ones look. They're big and fancy, but not exactly very strong. So if you wanted to go for strength over appearance, I would probably recommend doing a set of moose antlers. Those are a little more sturdy and wide. And seeing how they're very thin in stature, I'd only recommend you throw those in the oven for about 5 minutes at the previous stated temperature stated earlier, but just in case you weren't paying attention then, it is 275 degrees Fahrenheit and 135 degrees Celsius. And on closer observation, I realized the text is wrong. I got the Celsius thing down incorrectly. I'm Canadian, not American, so I'm not really used to dealing with that, unfortunately, and I'm also dyslexic, so I get things confused. I do apologize for the typo. So during this short time frame with them being in the oven and letting things cool down, this would be a good opportunity to go over your sculpture or your doll just to make sure you have those muscle layers all fine-tuned. That way you can kind of throw them around and get all those awkward angles that you need to without having to worry about damaging those big fancy antlers or any of the other previous, small fine details that you've already worked so hard to get at this point. Now we're going to move on and do a bit of painting. We're going to first start off with the antlers and move on to the skull and ribcage later on. You're going to see varying techniques at this point. There's going to be dry brushing, as well as I'm going to be using a bit of ballpoint pen just to kind of get some lines in there, especially on the antlers in particular. Now, if you're not familiar with the technique about dry brushing, I'm just going to fill you in briefly on what it is. Essentially, what you want to do once you have a freshly painted surface, maybe let it dry for about a minute to 30 seconds, then take an old worn out brush and then literally damage what you previously just did. And essentially the idea is you want to give it a little bit more of a weathered and worn look. And being a skull, I think that's a little bit more appropriate than it being a little more pristine. That's just not exactly how things really look in real life. So this is a part you're going to want a really steady hand for, just because the lines are very fine. And a little FYI, a lot of these clips are actually sped up, like probably say 1.5 is a good average. So this is not the normal speed that you're actually seeing. This is sped up quite a bit, so you can imagine how slow this process is in real life. Now, this is going to be a part you're also going to want to consider with caution as well. It's going to take quite a little bit of skill and precision to achieve this look, because getting your eyeball positions is very, very important, because that makes the difference between your character looking normal or completely cockeyed and kind of goofy looking at that point, and nobody's going to take that seriously. And again, I mean, it all depends on what you really want to go for. Personally, I didn't want my Wendigo to look like a comedy skit, so more or less I want him to be a serious character. And in that case, if you're wanting to go for more of a goofy look, I would recommend using a pair of googly eyes, because, well, that's what Milton has, and that seems to work fairly well for him. Now, this part is unfortunate because it's kind of a repair job that was done last minute. I definitely recommend this process a lot earlier in the build, but I'll admit what I was trying to kind of do in the beginning was get away with not having to add in the actual wire. Therefore, I would have a little bit more ankle movement, but he was not very stable on standing on his own, so it was necessary to add the wires in. And not only that, I'll admit I was trying to brainstorm how I could possibly make a set of hooves work for stop motion, and I could never really come to a good conclusion on that. The only way you could really have that pull off is essentially by doing a bunch of bolt down points. So you would have to have a set of screws or essentially bolts hanging out of his feet so you could screw him in to the actual set itself. Now, the way my studio basement is set up, that's kind of inconvenient and not really going to work at the time. So what I'm going to do is give him a set of regular feet with some sticky tack at the bottom, because that's worked fairly well for me so far. Now, this part is, well, not exactly really recommended. You could do it, you could not do it. Later on, I'm going to be adding hair, so you don't really see a lot of those. In certain angles, you might a little bit. I'll admit, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I had the parts and was like, I'm going to use it just in case there's the 1% chance that is not, there and someone will see it. Now we're going to move on and do a quick little detail here on the arm. Now, one person could probably argue you could have used the original skeleton for it, but however, technically there's 2 bones in your forearm, not 1, which is his frame essentially only has 1 in there, so I just made a little quick forearm piece just to give him some added character. I'm just going to do a quick placement of the final color or layer of clay for later on when we start adding some of the skin tone details before we unveil the skull and the antlers out of clear coat. So the clear coat is all dry at this point, and this comes the final unveiling. Now, I do have a few mixed feelings about it personally. I don't know if I should have used a shiny clear coat. I would probably recommend a nice matte one in comparison, because most bones aren't very shiny, but the main reason for doing this was to basically protect all that paint and pen work, just so my hands basically over time with the stop motion process don't wear down those details and then have to do a restoration project. Because I mean, it's fun sometimes, but it is a lot more work restoring these dolls sometimes than it is actually making them completely from scratch, unfortunately. Now, that'll vary on the age of the doll and, of course, how much abuse it's really seen over the years or, time, but generally speaking, this stuff does last quite a very long time. Now, you're going to want to pay close attention to my next upcoming race because, there's going to be some damage, unfortunately, on one of the cars, and it took me over 150 hours, and it's not something I really want to do, but it's going to look cool, so I'm gonna do it. And if you would like a sneak preview of what will be coming up in the race, there's a link available in the post description below, so be sure to check those out once you're done this video. Now, be forewarned, this is also a part that I personally did not find very easy. So a lot of the time I do find working on humans or monster creatures in some aspects easier than the cars because they don't need to be nearly as uniform. If you have a, straight line and it's on a car and there's another one that's not parallel to it, it sticks out like a sore thumb. And you're given a little bit more leniency with people in comparison because nobody is exactly perfect. But for the abs, essentially what you're going to do, I would recommend, is pushing down and leaving one layer sticking up a little bit more, because technically abs stick out, so don't carve, push in. Now this part is kind of a love-hate relationship, because you're covering up that cool rib cage that took forever to sculpt out of the skeleton. However, a lot of the time the Wendigo has a, well, not entirely exposed rib cage, so we're going to add in some bits of hair and rotten flesh just kind of hanging off there for some added detail and gore. Now, I'm sure by the pitch of music you can kind of tell we are approaching the end of the video and the last few steps here. Now, this one is kind of a hit and miss. I would be cautious on how much little added details you do add on later, because, I mean, these are cool, but later on, these are going to be a bit of a nightmare when you're doing your stop motion process, if you're going to try do some claymation with these characters. Because all those tiny little red spots later on are going to be problem areas. The more you work it, the more it's going to want to smush into the brown, and you're going to lose those small details. Now, this is also a fairly difficult part. Generally, making hands period are never that easy of a task, and I'll admit, at this point in the build process, I was like, I just wanted a little break from doing some of the camera work, so I did a quick time lapse. Now, on my most recent SCP that I made, which is technically Shy Guy, you can check that one out. I do have a slowed down version on how to make hands. Now, the feet are a part I'm generally never going to recommend putting a whole lot of detail into, especially with the setup that I have using sticky tack and the plasticine itself to kind of help hold the character up, because a lot of the time I position the cameras in certain angles so you can't see where their feet are, because generally they're pretty smushed beyond all recognition. So that way I have extra stability and don't have to worry about replacing the doll, because when things fall over, that is a nightmare and it is never fun trying to replace things. So proceed with caution, don't go overboard with detail here like me. I'm probably putting too much into it, but that's my own problem, not yours. It's just one of those unfortunate things that a claymation artist or stop motion artist is just gonna have to deal with sometimes. As frustrating it is, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. And I previously stated earlier on, there are other methods in place that can prevent that, essentially use a bolt, and I will probably actually start doing that on my dinosaurs because they are so heavy. Now, if you're unfamiliar with them, Sue is the T-Rex. She is about 4 pounds. And Jessicasaurus, or the Spinosaurus, is about 3 to 4, but is approximately the same size. However, I was a little bit smarter with the skeleton design. I used a lot more tinfoil on that one. So if you would like to see the dinosaurs, be sure to check those out in the post description below. I do have a lot of projects that I'm working on those in the future. I haven't done a lot of updates on them, but stop motion dinosaurs are a lot of work, because one thing I admit, as a kid, I was always a little disappointed that I never saw more of. But now that I've tried it, I can kind of understand why. Now we're going to turn our focus over back to the Wendigo. This is a part that's fairly hard too. I would imagine this is a nail designer's worst nightmare, seeing these big, long, gross-looking claw things on these human hands. This is a part that's going to take quite a bit of precision, so be very careful and be very patient. It's worth it in the end, because I think they honestly do look really cool, but it was not an easy thing to achieve. Now, this tool was mentioned earlier in the video. I was talking about handmade tools using guitar strings. Now, this is the one I was talking about. Essentially, it's just a little rake with a piece of guitar string that is hooped over and crudely taped onto a stick, but it works really well for cleaning out those tool marks. Now, this step I found quite fun or amusing because you get to kind of give your own Wendigo a little hairdo or hairstyle and haircut, so you get to play, well, I mean, hairstylist, I suppose. And personally, a lot of the stuff that comes with those craft bins is really fluffy, so you're going to want to use a lot of hair gel to help grease it down so it doesn't look nearly as poofy and cute. And it's always a good idea to take some of your excess and just kind of shove it into those corners, just so when you have his neck turn around, it doesn't show any bald spots. So essentially all I'm doing here to achieve that bead look is, well, they're not actually really hollow beads with hair running through it. It's just a little piece of oven-baked clay that has been painted blue and then is glued onto his hair to kind of give the appearance of a bead. Quick bandage around his wrist, just like the character design. Ooh, we only got a few more steps to go. Ah, the proud moment when the Wendigo finally gets his antlers. Now we can move on to some beauty shots to see what this guy really looks like. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this extended version or supercut version of how to make a Wendigo. Hopefully it helps you and encourages you to try and make your own little SCP scary monsters. It's a lot of fun, to be quite honest. I hope I can inspire a few more people out there to get into this claymation hobby. It's definitely a lot of fun, and personally the only real limit is your imagination. Now, I just wanted to thank you for watching as well as your support. Be sure to like the video if you enjoy it, comment what you think below, share with your friends, and subscribe if you're new. Anyway, that's enough from me. Till next time, take it easy.